Imagine a house where the television only had a few channels, where the phone was attached to the wall, and disappearing outside for hours meant freedom instead of danger. You rode bikes until sunset, drank water from a garden hose, and your parents had only one rule: come home before dark. If you grew up in the 1970s, this probably feels familiar. And if you didn't, it might sound almost unreal, like a different planet instead of just a different decade. People often assume that growing up in the 1970s was simpler, slower, maybe even easier. But psychology tells a more interesting story. The environment you grow up in quietly shapes the way you think, the way you trust, the way you solve problems, and even the way you relate to the modern world. And the people who grew up in the 1970s developed a very particular kind of mindset, one that was built in an analog world but forced to survive in a digital one. Think about what childhood looked like back then. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you didn't send a message, you walked to their house. If they weren't home, that was it. No updates, no location sharing, no instant connection. Your brain learned something powerful without you even realizing it. Patience. Waiting wasn't a frustration, it was normal. Delayed gratification became part of everyday life. Modern psychology talks a lot about delayed gratification. One famous experiment showed that children who could wait for a reward tended to do better later in life, academically, financially, emotionally. And without realizing it, many children of the 1970s were constantly practicing this skill. Waiting for your favorite show to come on at a specific time, waiting for photos to be developed, waiting days or weeks for letters. The world moved slower, and their minds adapted to that rhythm. But patience was only part of the story. Independence was another defining force. Many children of the 1970s experienced what psychologists now call free-range childhood. Parents often worked long hours, neighborhoods were full of kids, and supervision was lighter than what became common later. You figured things out yourself. You negotiated playground conflicts without adults stepping in. You got lost and found your way back. You made mistakes and dealt with the consequences. This kind of environment builds something psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle life's challenges. When you solve your own problems as a child, your brain develops a quiet confidence. Not loud confidence, not show-off confidence, but the kind that says, "I'll figure it out." You can still see this mindset today. Many people who grew up in the 1970s tend to approach problems differently. When something breaks, they try to fix it before replacing it. When something goes wrong, they improvise. They trust experience more than instructions. They learned early that life doesn't always come with guidance. And then there's boredom, something almost extinct today. In the 1970s, boredom wasn't a problem to be solved instantly with a screen. It was just part of being alive. Long afternoons with nothing planned, rainy days with limited options, endless car rides staring out the window. But here's the surprising part. Psychologists now believe boredom is deeply connected to creativity. When your mind isn't constantly stimulated, it begins to wander. It invents stories. It imagines possibilities. It connects ideas. Children who grew up in the 1970s spent a lot of time in this mental space. They built imaginary worlds with simple toys. They created games from nothing. A stick became a sword. A cardboard box became a spaceship. Their brains learned to generate stimulation instead of constantly consuming it. And that ability often stays for life. Another interesting psychological pattern shows up in how people from that era handle relationships. Before social media, relationships existed mostly in physical space. You saw the same people regularly, you talked face to face, misunderstandings couldn't hide behind text messages, apologies had to be spoken out loud. Psychologists often talk about something called social friction, the small difficulties that come with real human interaction. Today, we can avoid that friction by disappearing online. But in the 1970s, avoidance was harder. So people developed stronger conflict resolution skills without even realizing it. They learned how to read facial expressions, how to detect tone, how to sense when something felt off. These subtle skills became part of their emotional intelligence. And yet, there's also a quieter side to this generation's psychology. Many people who grew up in the 1970s were raised with the idea that emotions should be controlled rather than expressed. Be tough. Don't complain. Handle it yourself. From a psychological perspective, this created resilience, but sometimes at a cost. Some became very strong problem solvers, but struggled to talk about their inner world. They learned how to keep going, but not always how to open up. And if you think about it, that makes sense. The culture rewarded strength and independence. Vulnerability wasn't always encouraged. But resilience shaped them in powerful ways. People who grew up in the 1970s lived through enormous technological change. They went from rotary phones to smartphones, from handwritten letters to instant messaging, from physical maps to GPS. Imagine rewiring your habits again and again across decades. Psychologists call this cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt to new systems and environments. Ironically, a generation often stereotyped as old-fashioned had to become incredibly adaptable just to keep up with the pace of change. They learned computers as adults. They adjusted to digital workplaces. They navigated a world that transformed faster than anyone expected. And adaptation leaves a psychological mark. Many people from that era carry a unique balance between skepticism and openness. They remember a time before algorithms and targeted ads. They experienced information as something you searched for deliberately, not something constantly pushed towards you. Because of that, many developed a cautious relationship with new technology. Not rejection, caution. Their brains learned to ask, is this actually useful, instead of automatically accepting every new tool? Another psychological trait often appears in people who grew up during that time, a strong sense of practicality. When resources felt more limited and convenience was lower, waste felt more noticeable. Clothes were repaired, appliances were kept for years. Objects had stories attached to them. This environment shaped how value was perceived. Psychologically, value wasn't just about price, it was about usefulness and durability. Even today, you can sometimes recognize someone from that generation by how they treat things. There's a quiet respect for things that last. And maybe the most fascinating psychological effect of growing up in the 1970s is this strange feeling of being between worlds. Too young to be fully rooted in the past, but old enough to remember life before the digital age. They remember memorizing phone numbers, using encyclopedias, recording songs from the radio and hoping the DJ wouldn't talk over the intro. These memories create a kind of mental bridge between generations. They understand the speed of modern life, but they also remember what slowness felt like. And that memory shapes perspective. Because when you've lived in both worlds, you start to see time differently. You know that not everything needs to be instant. You know that silence isn't empty. You know that waiting doesn't mean wasting. And maybe that's the quiet psychological gift of growing up in the 1970s. A mind trained to live without constant stimulation, a confidence built through independence, a patience shaped by slower systems, a creativity born from boredom, and a resilience formed by change. If you grew up in the 1970s, some of these patterns might feel surprisingly familiar, things you never thought about but somehow always carried with you. And if this didn't resonate with you, maybe this gives you a glimpse into a different kind of mind, one shaped not by endless notifications but open afternoons and long conversations. Because psychology isn't just about personalities, it's about environments. The decades we grow up in quietly shape the people we become. And sometimes, understanding where your mindset came from helps you understand yourself a little more clearly. So maybe take a moment and think about your own childhood, the sounds, the routines, the little details that felt ordinary at the time. You might be surprised how much of your thinking still lives there. And if some of this resonated with you, I'd love to hear what growing up felt like in your world, because every generation carries its own kind of psychology, and every story adds another piece to the puzzle.